and that He is worthy. He is worthy. Today is the start of our self-denial period. That's what this little thing is about. For those who don't know what self-denial is, it is a time for us to either by prayer or by financial support, to support the missionaries that our denomination support in Asia and South Asia and Southeast Asia. So often it's about giving up something. As I said last week, I tried to give up coffee last time, and Carly said, "Get back on the coffee because you're horrible." So I have to give up something else this time. Anyway, the readings for this year's Prayer and Self-Denial Appeal are based on the book of Esther. And it's something you probably don't know, but we always have an open Bible on the communion table, or if it's not there, because we've got communions on in front. I always change the book to whatever I'm basing the sermon on. So the Bible is open at Esther today. Let me give you a quick snapshot of Esther if you haven't read it yourself, but I do suggest you read it. It's only 10 chapters long. You could probably read it in one sitting. Our home group on Wednesdays will be going through Esther at a chapter at a time, and so it's been really exciting. The story of Esther takes place during the reign of King Xerxes I of Persia, and it's primarily set in Susa, which is the capital of the Persian kingdom. 486 to 465 is where it's set in that period of 465 BC. It's all a long time ago. And that's more than 100 years after the Israelites were taken into captivity by King Nebuchadnezzar. And just over 50 years after Zerubbabel led the first group of exiles back into Jerusalem. But many Israelites stayed in Persia. They were part of what's called the diaspora, or the scattering of exiles through the nation. That's how big the kingdom of Persia was. Isn't it huge? From Libya to Greece to India, right up to the Black Sea. It's a huge kingdom. So although the Israelites were free to go back to Jerusalem, many of them had become established, and many of them didn't want to risk the dangerous journey back from Susa right back to Jerusalem. And Esther and her family were among the Jews who stayed. One day, well actually more than a day, 1 week, King Xerxes threw a lavish party, a week-long party. On the final day of the festivities, he's called for his queen, Vashti, to come and flaunt her beauty in front of his guests. But she refused to appear before the party. And filled with anger, Xerxes deposed her as the queen and sent her away. But he needed a queen. So to find a queen, he had a beauty pageant to try and choose the next queen. And Esther was chosen. Her cousin Mordecai became a minor official in the Persian kingdom as well. And then one day, Mordecai uncovered a plot to assassinate King Xerxes. And he told Esther about the conspiracy, and Esther reported to Xerxes, giving credit to Mordecai. And so there was investigated and found, yes, it was an assassination plot, and the two plotters were killed. But as in those countries of Persia, they always recorded things down. And so the record of Mordecai's act of kindness to his king was placed in the annals of the king. Now at the time, the king's highest official after the king was, perhaps we would call it the prime minister. He was a wicked man called Haman, or Haman. He was a descendant of Agag. the enemy of Israel and the king of the Amalekites. He hated the Jews. He hated them because the Israelites under King Saul had routed the Amalekites and killed King Agag. But that was centuries ago, so he held this historical grudge against the Israelites. He hated Mordecai because Mordecai refused to bow down to him and give him due deference. So Haman decided he had a plan, and he planned to get every Jew in Persia killed because Mordecai wouldn't bow down to him. And the king, signing his pieces of paper, didn't think about what was happening, and he signed away that edict which said, on such and such a date, all the Jews in my entire kingdom, from Libya to Greece, across to India, will be killed. Husband, wives and children. Mordecai learned of that plot, and he went to his cousin and said, you need to tell the king what's going to happen. And Esther went to the king. But if you went to the king and he didn't want you to go there, he would kill you. A nice man. But she risked her own safety to go before the king and to report what was happening. But she had to be tricky. And she invited Xerxes and she invited Haman to a banquet where she revealed her Jewish heritage to the king, as well as the details of Haman's plot to kill all the Jews. And in a rage, the king ordered Haman to be hung on the gallows he'd made for Mordecai. The book of Esther is the basis of the festival of Purim, P-U-R-I-M, in the Jewish calendar. It's one of the 5 major festivals of the Jewish calendar. It's because God delivered the Israelites from annihilation. But today I want to focus on this man called Haman. He seems like a despicable piece of work, doesn't he? But he must have had some qualities which endeared himself because he was the second in charge. And he was showered with riches, and he was blessed by God with many children. But the wheels fell off Haman's chariot. His pride and self-importance got in the way and caused him to fall. Because Haman expected everyone to bow down to him. But he was only the Prime Minister. He expected everyone to bow down and kowtow him, but he was only the Prime Minister. He expected to be treated as royalty rather than as a public official. His boots got too big for him. And it annoyed him that when everyone else bowed down to him as he walked past, Mordecai wouldn't. In Esther 3, 5 and 6 it says, when Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honour, he was enraged. And having learned that who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all of Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. Talk about overkill. One man annoys you, so you wipe out his entire race. Not only punish Mordecai for his supposed offence, but kill everybody else who happens to be of the same race. An early place call for genocide. And Haman obtained the king's consent to do that. I wonder what the king was thinking. Or maybe he just slid it under the king's ear. Sign this. Sign that. Put it in the middle of a pile of papers. I don't know. But the king didn't think it through. Pride rooted in selfishness can lead to hatred and revenge and murder. And it did that in the case of Haman. Upset that one man, Mordecai, refused to honour him, he decided to wipe out the entire race of that man. It was an amazing overreaction. He couldn't or wouldn't overlook a minor offence against him of someone who refused to bow down to him. Why didn't he just take a different road into the citadel? Why didn't he just turn a blind eye to this one man who wouldn't bow down? But he didn't. He took it to heart and it became his downfall. In Esther 5:10 and 13 it says, Haman sent and called for his friends and his wife Zeresh. And Haman recounted to them the splendour of his riches, the numbers of his sons, all the promotion that the king had honoured him, and how he advanced him above all the officials and ministers of the king. And Haman added, and even Queen Esther, let no one but myself come with the king to the banquet she's prepared. Tomorrow I'm invited by her together with the king. And then so he's got all this praise and stuff going, all this self-pride going on. And then in verse 13 he says, and yet all this does no good as long as that Jew Mordecai sitting at the gate doesn't bow down to me. Here's the pride and arrogance of the man. He was reveling in the fact that he'd been invited to a private dinner arrangement with the king and queen, where he could press on to his idea of genocide, and where no one else was invited. You know, there's a TV program called Kath and Kim, and she says, look at me, look at me, look at me. You know, and really Haman's prideful speech as to his family was saying, look at me, look at me, look at me, aren't I great? What Haman couldn't see at the time was his selfishness distorts his reality. And the final result of that vengeful pride that he has would be his own destruction. He would be hoisted by his own petard. I have no idea what a petard is, but apparently get hoisted by it. So why should we be looking at the story of Esther? Why should we start looking at the story of Haman when we're actually, this is about supporting our missionaries? The New Zealand Baptist Missionary Society suggests that this story reminds us of the various ways that idols distract our attention away from the mission of God. Our motivations, our priorities, our aspirations drive the way we live and behave. And when we constantly put ourselves first, others miss out. A writer called William Dembski wrote a book called The End of Christianity. Said this, our positive ideal determines what we value most. And what we value most shapes and compels us, regardless of whether it should shape or compel us. Reposing ultimate value in things is, of course, the essence of idolatry. Note the emphasis. What we value most shapes us and compels us. What we value most. What Haman valued above everything else was himself. Was his status, his sense of importance. He didn't even consider the king. Another writer says that the most two prominent characteristics of our culture now is idolatry of self and idolatry of money and material comfort. It seems that Haman had both. He had idolatry of material comfort and of self-aggrandizement. The pastor Andrew Murray wrote many years ago, over 100 years ago, that we have two great enemies by whom the devil tempts us and with whom we have to contend. One is the world without, in other words, outside of us. The other is the self-life within. The last, the selfish ego, is much more dangerous and stronger than the first. We are shaped by our ego. Remember chapter 5 says, Haman recounted to them the splendour of his riches, the number of his sons, all the promotions that he had been honoured with, and how he had been advanced above the officials and other ministers of the king. He was so full of himself. And there can be no greater idol than ourselves. An idol in this day and age is not necessarily made of metal or wood, but it's made of flesh, and that flesh is us. In the case of Haman, he had everything. He had high honour, he had position and privilege. He had an heir to the king, he had riches, he had numerous sons, which was a sign of God's blessing. Yet he was the epitome of the fact that there is an I in idol. The letter I. Number. Letter I. Because for everything that he had, there was a fly in his ointment. One man, and one man alone, who refused to give him the honour that he thought he deserved, and his world came crashing down. He sulked and schemed to wipe out Mordecai, but not only Mordecai, but everybody else who was even related distantly to Mordecai. He forgot, or chose not to remember, that it was actually Mordecai who saved the life of the king. Back at Esther 2:19, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, and now Esther had not revealed her kindred or her people as Mordecai had charged her, had told her. For Esther obeyed Mordecai just as when she was brought up by him. In those days, when Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, who guarded the threshold, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Ahasuerus. But the matter came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther. And Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. And when the affair was investigated and found to be so, both men were hanged on the gallows, and it was recorded in the book of the king. Haman decided that he was more important than the king. He was more important than the person who had saved the king. One night the king couldn't sleep. As you do, you get out a book of really boring stuff. And he asked his guys to read some of the stories in the annals of the king, which must have been like reading Hansard's political book. But he was reminded of that Mordecai had actually saved his life. And he wanted to honour him. And so it says in Esther 6, when Haman entered, the king asked him, "What should be done for a man the king delights to honour?" But, here we go. Mordecai thought, boy, he must be talking about me, because it's all about me. It's always about me. Now Haman said, who is there that the king would rather honour than me? So he answered the king, "For the man the king delights to honour, have them bring a royal robe that the king has worn, and a horse that the king has ridden, and the one with the royal crest placed on its chest. And then the robe and the horse would be entrusted to the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honour, lead him on a horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, 'This is what's done for the man the king delights to honour.'" It's all about me. And then it came crashing down, because the king said, "Go at once," the king commanded Haman, "get the robe and the horse, and do just as you've suggested for Mordecai, the Jew who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you've recommended." Oh dear. Not only did Haman hate Mordecai, he now had to honour Mordecai by putting him on a horse, putting him over, walking him through, leading the horse through town, saying, "This is what the man who..." I bet that stuck in his craw. I bet he was not happy. Haman, in his arrogance, realised that he was not the centre of attention. That the king made those decisions, not him. When we decide that our ways are higher and more important than the ways of others, that's idolatry. When we put the culture and the way we do things over top of what God wants or demands, that's idolatry. If we put ourselves first before God, that's idolatry. And this is where it comes for the relevance of mission. When the missionaries came from England to the Pacific Islands, they brought with them not only the Christian faith, but they also brought their Victorian morals and worldview, and wouldn't or couldn't differentiate between them. They couldn't see that the islanders were made in the image of God, and the missionaries considered themselves superior to these heathen, not looking for the God within them, nor the God revealed in them. Rather than bring the gospel and let the Pacific people express their love for God in their own way, they forced the islanders into Victorian cultural ways of being Christian. And we still see that in Pacific Island churches today, in their dress, in their songs. And we see that all over the world as well. We see a white Jesus, a Jesus who spoke ye olde English, stained glass windows with European apostles, worship services only conducted in English, or worse still before Vatican II, in Latin, all pointing to a sense of superiority and being right. That's why Christianity has such a bad name in the indigenous world, because it denies the indigenous expressions of faith, and it imposes a Western expression as the only expression. We've made an idol out of the way we do things, excluding any other expression of faith. Yet we're told we're not supposed to have any idols before God. We forget that our hopes and dreams and ideas of self-importance or of being right can be just as much an idol as the handcrafted physical forms that we see in the Bible and we see in indigenous cultures. When English missionaries came to New Zealand, they called Te Ao Māori, the Māori worldview, they called it evil, and forcefully imposed a Victorian Christianity instead. Not understanding that God was already known to the Māori. God the Father, they had a God, the ultimate supreme God is Io Matua Kore, which means a God with no father. They knew God. And instead of using that knowledge to build it on so we could then introduce them to Iu Karaiti, which is Jesus Christ, we said that all things Māori were wrong. There was a church in Invercargill, a Church of Christ building, and it had a gateway, a carved gateway, it looked like a gateway to a marae. And the furore about that from Christians. They never even went close enough to see that the carvings were actually the story of Jesus. But the fact that there was a gateway there, whose name escapes me, the Māori word for it, but they just couldn't see past the fact. You know, in some churches, I was talking to somebody recently who goes to another denomination, and Te Reo or any other languages are not allowed in their worship services. How gross. My friend David Moko, who you know as the former Kai Hautu of Manatu Iri Māori, which is Baptist Māori Ministries, said that we didn't bring Christ to this land. He was here already waiting for us. Rob Bell, an American, writes that the missions is less about the transportation of God from one place to another and more about identifying the God who's already there. It's pointing out to the people there that a creative, life-giving God who is already present in their midst. You know, we didn't bring God along with our suitcases into New Zealand. We don't take God in our suitcase when we go to the Pacific Islands or to the South Island. God's already there. God's already there. If if you read Phil Pauli's book, The Long Journey Forward, Long Walk Forward. I can't remember the name of your book. As he journeyed from Russell down through the country, he encountered people and they knew about God, but in different ways than we knew him. And it was a journey of discovery, of finding God in these places, amongst road workers and all that sort of stuff is what I remember in the film. Fannie Lou Hamer, who's a black civil rights leader and a Bible scholar, wrote, "It was truly a reality to me when I went to Africa, to Guinea. The little things had been taught to me about African people, that they were heathens and savages and they were just downright stupid people. But when I got to Guinea, we were greeted by the government of Guinea, which is black people. And we stayed at a place that was the government buildings because they were guests of the government. She went there with this preconceived idea of what it was that these Africans in the deepest, darkest Africa were like, and found it wasn't." Mick Duncan tells us another story similar to that about bringing God to a new area. Mick and his wife Ruby were missionaries and they went to the Philippines and they worked in the slums. And they brought their Western cultural ideas on how to solve the problems in those slums. But after being there for some years, living in a little shanty themselves and actually losing one child who died there, they finally heard God to say, dismantle what you'd built and allow the locals to work it out for themselves. Because what they found is they had disempowered the locals by bringing in their Western worldview. And he writes in his book called Costly Mission, which is out in our library if you want to read it. God to the people. Well, we've done that. Live with them. We've done that. Love them. We've tried to do that. But learn from them and start with what they know and build on what they have. This we hadn't done. As far as we were concerned, there was nothing good here. We concluded that the people had nothing to offer and it was up to us to do all that we could. And he goes on, I saw our well-intentioned, mercy-orientated work was in fact disempowering the poor. In our doling out of missionaries and money, we as servants were in active control, but we were reducing the Filipino poor to passive recipients. We were robbing them of their God-given mandate to be all that they were created to be. See, if we take our version of how we do church and how we relate to God as the only way, we commit idolatry because we are saying our ways are better than God's ways. If our preconceived ideas of how we do things is that way, we forget that God operates in a great big spectrum. When we have pride in our rightness, like Haman, we risk the wrath of God. Hopefully we won't get hung on a 75-foot gantry like Haman was. But Proverbs 16:18 reminds us, pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. God calls us to take stock of our hearts and the idols that were built in our hearts. Because we can't wholeheartedly participate in the service of God unless we take down those things which we have said God must work inside this area. Because when we do that, we're saying we're better than God. And that's the lesson today concerning missions. We had a little adage when I was at Eastside, our last church, and I've changed the word from Eastside, from the word church to God's mission. We are not God's mission to the people. We are not God's mission for the people. We are God's mission with the people. Now, we don't have all the answers. We don't have all the answers. Why do we assume that we do? God has the answers. We need to seek God and say, hey, I've never done it that way before, but God, if that's where you want me to go, that's where we're going. So I leave you with that. What are the idols in your life? Idols of practice, idols of I'm right and everyone else is wrong. How do we upset those to allow God be first so that we can do God's work in our lives?
Chris, maybe